So I'm going to start by taking you on a little journey. So let's start with a story, because at least in the UK, we've been in lockdown for about 3 months, so we've not been outside the house. And let me take you halfway around the world. I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 6,000 kilometers across 2 continents, from Lebanon and Asia to Mozambique and Africa. So it has some of the world's highest mountains, but also some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is a lake called Lake Magadi, which is on the southernmost tip of the Great Rift Valley. So you might think, well, it's hard for you to imagine that you're there because many of us haven't been there, but some of us will have seen this lake. You might have seen this in the movie The Constant Gardener, based on the John le Carré novel of the same name. And indeed, millions of people have seen this lake because of the movie, but fewer than 1,000 people call Lake Magadi their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, so he makes a living herding and selling goats. So it used to be that for Emmanuel, cash was king. So it was cash that he'd receive when he sold a goat. He'd then have to check that cash in case it was fake. He'd have to store that cash at risk of robbery. And then to bank that cash, he had to walk not 1 hour, 1 day to the nearest bank. And because of that, he couldn't graze his goats around the greenest pastures. He had to live within 1 day of a bank. So his life was tough. But all of that changed because of the topic of today's webinar, a responsible business. And that responsible business was Vodafone, which is a large UK telecoms company. So in 2007, they launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Africa. So let me take a moment to explain what mobile money is, because often people confuse it with mobile banking. Right, I have a bank account and I can operate it on the phone rather than going to a branch. But with mobile money, you don't even need to have a bank account to begin with. And that's important because many people in Kenya don't have access to banking. So this has transformed the life of Emmanuel Saronga, right? So he no longer needs to deal with cash. He doesn't need to worry about forgery or robbery. And he can graze his goats near the greenest pastures. He doesn't need to live within a day of the bank. And also, his accounting is easy. He's got a record of all of his transactions on his phone. And we don't want to just over-extrapolate from one example. There was a study by faculty at MIT which showed that within the 7 years of M-Pesa arriving in Kenya, 200,000 households got lifted out of poverty. And importantly, many of these households were headed up by women because it allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So that's one story that I have about Vodafone. But let me tell you a different story. And this story is about tax. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first company in the telecoms industry around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And that's important if you're a telecoms firm. Why? Because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax regimes. So I've got a question to everybody on this webinar. It's great, we've hit 100 people. And there's 2 questions, actually. One is, which of these decisions created most value for society? And number 2, which of these decisions, if you didn't take them, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's corporate social responsibility rating or reputation? Now, I'm not going to poll anybody here, because I'm pretty sure that everybody would agree on the answers. Which decision created most value for society? It was the first one, where M-Pesa lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. But what would have happened had Vodafone not launched M-Pesa? What would have been the public outrage? Nothing. Well, you don't get in trouble for not doing something. Right? The media would have never expected you to have done this. Why? Because they would have never thought it was possible to have this crazy idea of banking without a bank. But what is the backlash if you're not transparent about tax? it could be really significant. Right, so in fact, 2 years previously, in 2010, it was reported that Vodafone had avoided £6 billion in tax. And around the same time, the Chancellor of the UK, who's the person in charge of all of the finances of the country, he reported £6 billion of spending cuts. So you can imagine what the headlines would have been, right? You, the taxpayer, are suffering £6 billion of austerity because this greedy company isn't paying tax. And the headlines were massive, right? So we had these issues such as boycotts of Vodafone stores, right? So don't get me wrong. It's absolutely important for a company to pay fair tax and to pay fair wages and so on. But you didn't need to come on this webinar to hear that companies should pay tax. Well, you already knew that. Instead, what I want to do is shift our thinking on responsible business and give a different viewpoint. Why? Because we often think that responsible business is about do no harm. Don't do bad things. Don't cheat on tax. Don't mistreat your workers. Otherwise, you're going to get public outrage. But what I want to say is that that is not enough. Well, it's not enough just to play by all the rules. A responsible business must actively do good through things such as launching M-Pesa if you're Vodafone. So that goes to the framework that I talk about in my book, which is we can think about the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And that pie can be given either to investors in the form of profits, which is blue, or stakeholders, society, in the form of value, which is orange. And we think that a responsible business is one that splits the pie fairly so it moves to here. And indeed, that's why it's important to pay fair taxes and pay fair wages rather than just taking too much profit. But there's two problems with viewing responsibility as just being about splitting the pie. Well, the first problem is if responsibility is about going from here to here, right, then it's not something that companies will want to do themselves, right? It will need to be imposed by law. Why? Because if it's going to make the company worse off, then you don't want to do it. And indeed, you will know that 181 CEOs in the US last August signed this business roundtable statement claiming they were going to serve wider society, but many of them haven't done anything about it. And that's not surprising, because if responsibility makes the company less profitable, then don't do it. So that's the first reason, is if indeed responsibility makes a company less profitable, companies won't do it by themselves. And the second reason why this view is limited is it's bad for investors, right? Investors make less money. Now, often people think, I don't care, right? Because investors are often seen as nameless, faceless capitalists, right? We view society, the orange, as us, investors, the blue, as them. So we want to take from them and give to us. So any politician who says, I'm going to reform business to give to you and to take away from investors, they're going to get a lot of support. But that doesn't make sense, because investors are not them. They are us, right? They include parents saving for their children's education. They include pension funds saving for retirement, and insurance companies laying aside to fund future claims. So any repurposing of business needs to take investors seriously, as well as wider society. So that's why my view of responsible business is different. So it's about growing the pie. So actively creating value for both society and investors. So absolutely, we do want to increase the orange. We want to create value for society, but we do that not by giving them a higher share of what's already there, right? We don't just give charitable donations. We do this through innovation and excellence, doing these crazy ideas like launching this idea of banking without a bank. Why is that a good way to do things? Well, Vodafone launched M-Pesa genuinely to solve a social problem of lack of financial inclusion. But as a byproduct of doing so, they were able to monetize this and therefore investors became better off. So to conclude the first part of my talk, right, what I call it in the book, you might love or you might hate the phrase, but call it pie economics. Right, this is about creating profits only through creating value for society. So let's take a minute to pick apart that definition. Right, responsibility is about creating value for society. Again, you knew that before you came on this webinar. But what is new is the first part. It's create profits through creating value for society. So the way we create value isn't just through paying fair taxes and wages and giving profits to charities, but through innovation and excellence and productivity, and that also leads to a company being profitable. But the other important word here is the word only, right? Because there's one way to create profits, which is to split the pie differently, to move from here to here. Right, you might know Turing Pharmaceuticals in America bought existing drugs and hiked the prices 56 times. Right, instead, we don't create profits by extracting from society, but instead through innovation, and that's what we're about. Okay, so at this point in the talk, you might be in two minds. So you might be inspired. So you might say, well, what Alex says is great, right? Responsible businesses can serve society and can also be profitable, but you also might be skeptical. Like, where is the evidence for this? Right, because it sounds too good to be true. Yeah, it would be nice if companies that were good for society were magically more profitable, but is this really the case? So that's the role of academic research, which is what people like Julio and I spend actually most of our time doing. So yes, we indeed engage in a lot of teaching, but when we're not teaching, we're doing research. And what research involves is actually trying to look rigorously at whether there's a link between these two variables, right? And studying the link is quite difficult because how do we measure whether a company is responsible? Right, one approach might be look at their purpose statements or look at whether they sign the Business Roundtable statement, but that's not a good measure because people can say things without doing it. So what I wanted to do was I measured how well a company is treating its employees. So why did I look at that? Well, employees are not the only member of society. We care about the environment, we care about customers, but I chose to look at employees because I have a very good measure available, and that is the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America. So that list is really good because it was available from 1984. So I had 28 years of data before I finished the study. And that's really important because responsibility is a new thing. Well, it's only been around in mainstream for the last 5 or 10 years. And as a result of that, like many of the data sources are only available for 5 or 10 years. And therefore, it might be that it only works in an economic upswing. Right before the pandemic, the last 5 or 10 years have been really good. And if we think it only works in an upswing, then many people will want to cut responsibility now that we're in a pandemic. And also why this was good is it was very thorough. It didn't just look at pay, even though pay is important. It looked at other things such as trust in management and pride in your jobs. And as we all know, correlation doesn't imply causation. So I had to check, is it employee satisfaction that causes better performance? Or is it better performance that allows a company to invest in employee satisfaction? Right, so after all that blood, sweat and tears, and Julio will know that it takes sort of 4 to 5 years sometimes to get a paper and then published in the top journal, I found that the 100 best companies to work for in America deliver stock returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period. So that's 89 to 184% cumulative. And so that is profound, right? This fundamentally changes the way that companies should think about their workers, not just as a cost center, right, to be minimized, but as a source of sustainable value. So treating your workers well doesn't donate the pie to them, it grows the pie because they become more efficient and more productive. And so now what I want to do for the final second half of the talk is to think about what are the implications for practitioners. And so there's going to be 3 short sections. So the first is, well, what are the implications for companies? So it means that creating value for society is a CEO level issue. Right? I haven't used the word corporate social responsibility much in this talk. Why? Because CSR has the connotation of being something pigeonholed into a CSR department, which is non-core. Right, instead, because the evidence shows that responsibility is linked to long-term performance, these are things that a CEO should take really seriously. Right, and sometimes when I speak at these practitioner conferences, people introduce me as a professor of finance, and the audience sometimes gives a double take. They think they've misheard, because often finance people are the enemy of responsibility. They think it's a waste of money. But what this evidence shows is that it's financially important to consider these factors. The second implication is for investors. So when I started, my first job was at Wharton in the US in 2007. The first time I went to a responsibility conference, right, the investors who were there were not mainstream investors. They were socially responsible investors who didn't just want to make money, they want to achieve climate change or gender parity. But nowadays, even mainstream investors who all they want to do is make money, and that's fine, right? If you're a pension fund, you need to make money. Even they care about responsibility. We know that every year, Larry Fink writes a letter to the BlackRock companies that he invests in to make sure that they know of the importance of serving a purpose. Okay, two final things. So what I've just shown is that it's important. This is mainstream. It is core. These things are not non-financial factors that only socially responsible investors should care about. These are financial, and every investor should take into account how well a company is serving society. So we need to think about, well, how do we put this into practice? And here, I'm going to get into one of the most tricky issues, the elephant in the room, which is how do we make a decision under responsible business? Because finance professors like Julio and I have been teaching for the last 50 years that you make these decisions based on net present value, right? We teach our business students, calculate the net present value of an investment, and if it's positive, you take it. But if instead the goal is not shareholder value, but creating value for society, we need a different way to make decisions. And so in the book, I have 3 principles that companies should try to follow when choosing what investments to take and which to turn down. I don't want to go through all of them because I want to make sure that Verónica and Germán have enough time to speak, so I'm only going to go through the third one, which is the principle of materiality. So what do I mean by that? Well, in order to get to that, I have to explain what I mean by purpose, because that's been a subtext to my talk, but I've never really defined it. So what does purpose mean? This is one of the most misunderstood things, I think, in responsible business. Often people think that purposeful means altruistic, right? A purposeful company is one that cares about society. But that's not what the word purposeful means. Right? Semantically, purposeful means targeted and focused. A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So this means that a company's purpose must know what to do, but also what not to do. So you can't have a purpose statement like that first red bullet to serve workers, suppliers, customers, the environment, communities, and investors. That sounds great, but it's unrealistic because in reality, we have trade-offs. So let's take Engie. That's a French energy company. They had to decide, do we shut down Hazelwood, which is the most polluting energy plant in the OECD? If we do that, it's going to be good for the environment, but it's going to be bad for workers. They're going to lose their jobs. So if their purpose was workers and the environment, there's no way to make that decision. So instead, I define purpose as the answer to the question, how is the world a better place by your company being here? And the answer to that question has to be focused. It's like a citizen's purpose. were never to be a professor and a lawyer and a teacher and a doctor, you'd only be one of those things. And so that's the idea of materiality. We have all of these stakeholders that we can serve, but materiality is about finding out, well, which are the most material stakeholders for us? And so this takes me to the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. This is a body which tries to encourage sustainability reporting. It goes through every industry and explains what the most material stakeholders are. For example, the left column, minerals processing, right? The environment matters, because if there's a flood, you might not be able to access your mine. But for financials, which is the second column, right, the environment doesn't matter so much to you. What is more fundamental for your business is social capital, so people's trust in data security, customer privacy, that you're not ripping them off with hidden fees. And here's a really important study. So what this finds, and it's the final study I'm going to show, this one finds that if we take MSCI, which is perhaps the best well-known measure of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, companies that do well on everything, they don't actually beat the market. They only beat it by 1.5% per year, which is statistically insignificant. However, if you find companies that do well on only the material issues and scale back on the immaterial ones, they do beat the market by 4.8% per year. And I think this is profound, because what it means is it's better to be good at only a few things than to be good at everything. Because if you're good at everything, you have no priority structure, you have no sense of discernment, you're probably forgetting about investors. You're trying to be all things to all people. And so this goes to my final section, which is how do we think about applying this to the crisis? So in the pandemic, we've seen some amazing actions here by companies, and I'm going to call them pie splitting actions. So these are cases where investors and executives are bearing their share of a shrinking pie to ensure that others don't have to lose. So some CEOs of Boeing or Marriott or United Airlines, they're getting paid nothing. There's some companies that are continuing to pay their workers. So Wynn Resorts, their workers are furloughed, but they're still getting paid. And there's companies which are giving stuff to customers. So Unilever is giving 100 million euros of sanitizer and food to communities. And all of these things are great, right? All companies that have done that, they should be praised. But why I started this talk with Vodafone and M-Pesa and the importance of pie growing is not everybody can split the pie. What if you don't have pie to give because you're going to go out of business? Right? What if you don't have 100 million euros lying around because you're a small company? What if you're not in the food and sanitizer industry? You don't have relevant products. So this is why pie growing is important. And that is asking the question, what is in your hand? So what resources does my company have? And how can I think creatively about how to deploy them to serve wider society? So what is great is this allows companies, even in unrelated industries, to play their part. So one example is Chelsea Football Club. So Chelsea Football Club, they don't have anything which is clearly related, right? Football doesn't help you in a pandemic. But what is in their hand? It is a hotel. And they're allowing doctors and nurses to stay at that hotel so they don't have to trek home, which is really hard because there's not good public transport at the moment. What if you're a large company hit by the crisis? So let's say you're Qantas Airways. You would love to keep paying your workers, but it's commercially impossible because your revenues have been completely hit. But what is in their hand is a relationship with Woolworths, which is a grocery store within Australia. And at the moment, the relationship is that if you buy groceries at Woolworths, you can get some air miles with Qantas. But they have leveraged that relationship in order to allow people who are furloughed to be redeployed to Woolworths. And finally, what if you're a small company and you can't really do anything to help because you're so small? Well, let me give you an example of a company that I'm a customer of. It's called Barry's Boot Camp. It's a really, really tough workout. So David Beckham goes to this, Harry Styles, Ellie Goulding, and so on, and then just normal poor people like me. So the gyms are closed, unfortunately, but so they can't do anything. But what they're doing is they're offering free online workouts, which are really important because many people can't leave their house and physical wellness is important. But you might think, well, it's not too creative for a fitness company to offer online fitness workouts. But here is the great thing. Like, what if you work on the reception desk of the gym? How can you help out in the crisis when the gym is closed? Well, what it turns out is that many of these receptionists are actors as their main job. But if you're an actor, your income is quite volatile, so they take this Barry's Boot Camp job to provide them with stability. And if you're an actor, what is in your hand? Well, you're really funny. Well, how does that help out in the crisis? Well, we have a lot of working parents where their children are at home because the schools are shut. So what they're offering are things like free online storytelling via Zoom to take the load off working parents. So I think that's a great example of even a small company can play a role in such a large crisis. And I think that if there is any silver lining to this really devastating pandemic, it is that we might change our view on responsible business. It's not only about not doing harm, but positively doing good through innovation. And so my last slide before I hand over to Verónica and Germán. So as Julio kindly mentioned, I just wrote a book about this called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And I have this slide not to be sort of a crude plug of the book, but because this is something where there is a lot of evidence behind it. Because historically, right, people always thought that responsible business is about being fluffy, it's about saving the dolphins, it's about something which is not related to actually being successful. And so a lot of people, particularly investors or hard-headed businessmen and businesswomen, were skeptical about it because they thought that it's going to make a company worse off. But in fact, what I want to show is that actually you can be both responsible and highly profitable. I'm sure that Verónica and Germán will elaborate on that point. And it's based on a lot of rigorous evidence, but unfortunately a lot of academic research is written for really boring and stuffy academic journals, which is really incomprehensible for any normal person to understand. So what I've tried to do is to make it available for a general audience. So it's available in Chile through Ubuy, but Julio mentioned that he can get it through Amazon in the US and it ships quite quickly. There's also Book Depository, which ships around the world for free. So hopefully for those of you who are interested in responsible business, either as a practitioner or you'd like to learn about it, both the good and the bad and both sides of the evidence, then hopefully this would be a great resource. And there might be people who can't afford to buy a book, right? So what I've done on that website here is to put a lot of free material that I've written on responsible business, so that if this is of interest, but because of the crisis, the book is sort of unaffordable, hopefully there's some material there which might be of help. Thank you very much again to everybody's attention. I look forward now to learning from the other panelists.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. It's a great presentation. Great insights.
I think you might be on mute. Oh, no,
how to find your purpose. And so now we're going to have Verónica. She's going to address some of the issues in your talk, and in particular, she's going to spend some time about defining purpose and the short and long-term view of decisions. So, Verónica, thank you.
Thank you, Julio, and thank you, Alex, and hi, everyone. Well, thank you, Alex, for your book, because this is a really important topic, I think, for our future, you know, to really reach a new kind of economy. I've been working on purpose-driven companies before, especially big corporations. So first, I would like to talk about a little bit about these kind of businesses, because they are very visible because of the brand. So if any of the people that is in this webinar wants to know more about purpose-driven companies, they can look in Chile, for example, there are more than 100 B corporations, and this is a certification that where businesses have to prove that they have a social or environmental purpose in their business model. So that's a really important thing. It's not CSR. It explains why this business is doing what they are doing, you know? And I think this is a really important thing. The business is a sort of tactic, if you want, to make a change. You can use the business mechanism to create a positive impact. So, of course, there is a diversity on all these businesses, but it is a sort of social movement which is emergent, and a kind of business activism even. So you can hear some of the CEOs of these big corporations saying that we are activists. We want to use businesses to create positive impact and doing profit too, but as a result, as a consequence. And in this sense, it is very interesting to explore these cases, because you can see that innovation is not just about products or processes, it is about how you can imagine your business. And one of the things I want to talk about is how to define the purpose and not to fall into a greenwash use of the word purpose. No, it is a risk always. The same it was with the CSR. So I think there is an issue with meaning making. So people, the owners, the shareholders, the managers, I think they have to think why they want to do what they are doing and what is feasible through their business. And including this reflection of at the heart of the business to really define what can they do. So this is a topic that need an organizational process, if you want. So that was one thing. I think the thing is not to think about what new need I'm creating, but what social or environmental problem I am solving through business. Okay. And globally, there are almost more than 3,000 big corporations now, and there are many of them. There are small and medium companies, but there are also transnational doing it. For example, Danone or Unilever. Danone is trying to become the first transnational completely certified as a B Corp. So it is very interesting also to see for big companies that may think that this is a big challenge and almost too difficult sometimes to do it, but it is feasible. There are strategies to do it. So step by step. And as Alex told us, employees, managers just have this positive impact to continue transforming the business to create this positive impact. So again, it's like the meaning-making issue of business. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is about this imperative of short-term versus long-term. So everybody is in this accelerated world and always pursuing short-term, except now because of the pandemic, everything stopped. And we were able to see things maybe different. And there is a lot of people saying that, but it's very difficult also to do it. So how to change the incentives or the structure of incentives, it's not easy when everybody's using the same pattern of short term. So this is a really interesting issue on how really to have long-term incentives. I think there is very interesting cases of new emergent businesses as regenerative businesses that are trying to regenerate degraded ecosystem, and they are forced, because of their purpose, they are forced to synchronize their business decision to nature. So there are some things that are happening, and we can explore also in these examples to see how to do it. So I think that would be my comment.
Thank you, Veronica. Thanks for putting up this complementary perspective. Now we have Germán Heufemann. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the governance part of this, and particularly bring it very closer to our Latin American circumstances. There's dispersion in ownership structure. There's issues that are related to resources that are very important here, and the way the governance answers come as they relate to the different stakeholders play a particularly important role. So thank you, Germán.
Thanks, Julio and Veronica, and congratulations, Alex, for your book. I think it's very interesting, and it helps a lot of people to understand that it's not about to share the same pie, but instead is to how to grow the pie. And it's a good way to understand in simple terms with a lot of evidence what you mentioned. I would like to highlight 2 or 3 points that are related with the context of disruptive crisis in the Latin American context in particular. I think it could be useful for the audience and also for you, Alex. The first thing I would like to mention is I really believe that purpose and communication of the purpose is key, but I will add active engagement. I really think the power of investors and the power of money makes the purpose feel and makes the purpose highlight in terms of a market. What I mean with this, for example, in many corporations of Latin America, we have this controlling shareholder structure, the concentration of the ownership of the companies. So when you have a controlling shareholder, you have minority shareholders. And in the past years, many controlling shareholders thought that there is a kind of fight between the ideas of business that this controlling shareholder has in comparison with the ideas of some minority shareholders. Basically, I would say the institutional investors. In this market, one of the most important are the pension funds, basically, local pension funds. They manage, the money of the citizens. So I will say that view in the context of this disruptive crisis change in a way that it becomes in a constructive ESG relationship. It's not minority shareholders against the controlling shareholder. It's a process of active engagement, is building together a new relationship, looking at the purpose of the company. That's a key point for me. Talking about the G, the governance, and in particular the board, I think it's time for the G, for the governance, to have a responsibility in terms of the social impact on this sanitary crisis. I think, at least in Latin America, the effects in terms of social impacts, negative impact, will be huge. And I think the board has a key role in working in the social impacts. What kind of impacts? Looking at the supply chain, for example, take care of key suppliers and not just cut them. Thinking in the employees in terms of the digital transformation, what I call the smart working. We are now doing a smart conference or diffusion of the knowledge, yeah? So what's the impact of this digital transformation for the employees in terms of quality of personal life, family life, and workload as well? And also the employees in terms of survival. I mean, many companies are thinking how to survive in these periods, but survive has a component of what's next. there is a web page I recommend to you look at, justcapital.com. They track what are the key measures, the 100 key or most important employers of states are doing in times of COVID-19. And one of the findings is quite interesting. They published 2 days ago. They found that companies that prioritize their workers continue outperform the companies that don't really care about what's going on with the workers. So supply chain, digital transformation, employees, definitions of the companies are key responsibilities of the governance at this point. And that has to be discussed and communicated with the key institutional investor. That's what I call the active engagement. It's not answering questionnaires coming from responsible investors or ESG investors, but this is also actively communicating with them and explaining the meaning, the purpose of the company in this time of crisis. And finally, I will say that this G responsibility has to be actively managed, not only with the statements, not only with declarations, but also with relations with other industries. As you mentioned, what is the impact of related initiatives in terms of social support or environmental support for industry that are more affected with the crisis, this COVID crisis. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and I will be happy to answer any question. Thanks.
Thank you, Germán. Thank you, Verónica. Thank you, Alex. So this further information from our panelists, we see some kind of common topics, in the sense of the importance of purpose, the importance of communicating purpose and letting know your investor base. Why are you making these decisions? Because sometimes there are these trade-offs, and when a company is opting, for example, as Germán was saying, for being kind of like pro employees, and well, sometimes our investors may feel this, that well, this better treatment of employees may be coming out of my pocket, whereas some of the evidence that Alex shared with us, and some of the more recent evidence that Germán was pointing out, showing that well, in cases this could be even good for investors. So actively engaging investors and communicating your purpose is really important, and the role of purpose, as Verónica was saying. So I guess we can take a couple minutes, so you can, Alex, maybe you want to react to some of these comments, and then we go to some of the audience questions to continue the conversation.
Sure, I just like to re-emphasize and fully agree with Germán's importance of engagement by investors. And I think that's really one of the main ways in which my view on responsible business might differ from conventional views. So often people think that investors are the enemy. So they will say, well, shareholders are always trying to take the pie by extracting profits, by cutting wages and polluting the environment. And sort of that makes for great stories. So the media likes to say, well, this investor came in and screwed up the company. But I don't think that's what the evidence suggests, is that engagement typically improves the pie. So stakeholders benefit as well, because engaged investors are an external sounding board to provide some independent viewpoint on how a company is run. And so absolutely, I think it's important to not view investors as the enemy, but to view investors as partners in growing the pie, and the extent to which we encourage engagement on the important dimensions, I believe this will be really important for the repurposing of capitalism.
Thanks. So we have a couple of questions related to, and I think this could be for all three of you. So one question relates to the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals and the role in defining a corporate social responsibility strategy, or maybe we can say even a grow the pie kind of strategy, more broadly perhaps. What's your opinion about them? And and if there are other sources of ideas for this. Also related to this, Jose Opaso asks, well, these SDG are supposed to guide governance and corporate strategy. Do they guide corporate social responsibility strategy or business strategy? I guess relating to the CEO's engagement or board engagement in this as I guess opposed to or an alternative to complement a role more departmentalistic, I guess. And a second question related to the strengths of the Sustainable Development Goals in the systemic integrated approach to development. And so here, I guess, about your question or some of the ideas about doing a few things and not everything. Here the comments, well, companies split them up and normally say, well, I contribute to this or this or this. What's your reaction to this approach to sustainability?
Sure, I'm happy to go first and then pass it on to Veronica and Hernan. And I see there was also a good question by Hernan, but that's separate, so I'd like to take that afterwards. But these first two I'll take together. So this is only my view, and people might disagree. I don't think you should use the Sustainable Development Goals to decide what your CSR strategy is. So I think they're a very useful reporting framework. So after you've decided your strategy, then you can say what SDGs they fulfill. But I think that decide what your strategy is, that should depend on your comparative advantage. So what is your company really well placed to do? And who are the stakeholders that are most material to your business? So after deciding that, then you can report according to the SDGs. And what the SDGs are good at is they allow for comparability. Right, so let's take goal 2, that is zero hunger. So Danone, which is a food company, clearly contributes to goal 2 because it's a food company. But Vodafone also contributes to zero hunger because by providing farmers with access to weather information, they can grow their food more effectively. So that's what I think it's useful for reporting, so that companies in very different industries can all describe how they're contributing to a common goal, but I don't think we should lead with that. And to Jose's question, I think it is fair for a company to then therefore only contribute to a few of them. So there are some companies, like Unilever is good in many ways, but they say we contribute to all 17 SDGs, and some of their links are pretty tenuous. Whereas Vodafone says, this is our strategy, it's connectivity. As well, here are the 3 that we focus more on. Then there's a second tier, and then there's a third tier. So I think you first decide your strategy based on what your company is good at, based on also market opportunities, and the same things that you look at for business strategy, like Porter 5 Forces, competitive dynamics, that decides that, and then you use SDGs as a reporting framework.
Verónica, Germán, do you want to take this?
Yeah, I agree with the views of Alex about the SDGs in terms of they are nice and good as a reporting framework. But as he mentioned, I think it's useful to decide what's your strategy and then understand in terms of reporting how this strategy fits eventually, and define an action plan related with that. But also this makes me think about this duality between the sustainable strategy versus the business strategy. And many companies think they have to run 2 different strategies. But at the end, at least for my understanding, a company has to have one sustainable business strategy. It's just one. Then it will grow the pie finally. So when you have these big departments or areas of sustainability, and they are disconnected with the board decision making, we have a big problem in terms of how to grow the pie, for example. So basically my views are a connection in the company between sustainability areas, the investor relations area, the finance areas, with the board in terms of what we understand as sustainability, what is the contribution to one of these 17 SDG goals. It's key, more than create a strategy based on the SDG goals.
Germán. Verónica?
Yes, I just wanted to say about the purpose, how to define purpose. There was a couple of questions there. So there is some research about how entrepreneurs define to be, for example, big corporations, and there is a lot about people behind the business, you know, and many times these are people that really believe in some social or environmental cause, and so there is like a coherence in the business development. So there is no too many questions. Sometimes, you know, they follow a lot of their instinct too, and what they want to do in terms of impact, and then they have to work a bit more on how to deal with some tensions on between economic issues and the social or environmental purpose. But that's why I said that before, that I think there is a company that want to include a social or environmental purpose in the business model. It is not just a periphery issue. It has to be as part of the business model. They have to rethink or what are they doing, why they want to do it, and follow a bit a profound reflection that may be guided by SDGs or other personal issues, you know. But so it's a lot of personal reflection on managers, owners that create a path, I think.
Thank you, Veronica. So we have an extra couple set of a few minutes, and there are a couple of questions that are very interesting. And so there's, I think they're somewhat related. I'm going to put them both together. So Diego and Avillagran said something that may be related. If I'm misinterpreting you, I'm sorry. So how do you relate ethics with the purpose of a company, and how much importance do you give to it? And the other part would be whether you agree or disagree with the proposition that business corporations have human rights obligations under international human rights law. Thinking that there's a treaty apparently being drafted about this at the UN. So ethics and human rights obligations as they relate to the role of the company. So that on one part. And the other question is about key ESG variables that are data sources that all three of you think are key to keep an eye on and give you an idea of companies' performance in the medium and longer run.
Yeah, Julio, I would like to answer the question of Hernan. I understand he wants a very specific, like a tip. As I mentioned, and Alex as well, there is an organization called PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investors. So basically, you find in that organization, the Principles for Responsible Investment, you find those institutional investors that take care, when they invest, they take care of ESG factors, if you want. So if you go to that webpage, the Principles for Responsible Investment, you can find publicly available, you can find the names of the asset owners, the asset managers that invest using ESG factors. And you can filter the information, you can find the investor in your region of interest, and you can research them. In some cases, you can download the reporting framework. It's a yearly report. And you also can go and research those institutional investors, for example, their responsible investment policy, so you can understand what they really see, what they are looking for when they invest in specific sectors. What Hernan mentioned as a materiality. You can learn the materiality of specific industries, looking at the strategies and the policies and the strategies of responsible investor on this kind of institutional investors. That's one straight way to really understand what they are looking for in specific sectors and geographical areas.
Yes, Germán. So
I'm happy to add to that one.
Yeah.
So Hernan was great. So I was going to talk about some data sources, but he's already said more than I would say. So I would supplement that with actually something quite different, which is the boots on the ground approach of just talking to management. And so why I think this is really important is that we would love to have these data sources which say measure your carbon footprint and your gender parity, but it can't be just that, because if we were to form our ESG strategy on that, we would lose our job. Why? Because a smart beta fund can do that. Well, a computer can do that. We already have smart beta funds looking at profits and dividends and momentum. So what I'm putting here in the chat is a journal of a responsible investment firm called 12 Countries in 12 Months, which does exactly what it says on the tin. So they refuse to invest in any company unless they've looked the management in the eye, visited the factories. And a lot of these are developing countries, so the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, South Africa, Turkey. And there the disclosure isn't so great. And what's so surprising is that even the most basic questions, where you might think that there's been some prep for the investor relations that told management how to answer, those questions are really telling. So this gives an example of the type of questions that you're able to ask. I realize that we're running out of time. So for the others, if you just drop me a note on LinkedIn with the questions that are unanswered, I'd be really happy to answer them. I will guarantee to answer any question that people send me on LinkedIn. I really appreciate people joining this webinar. I'm sorry that we're running out of time. I think Veronica might also have something to say to some of those questions.
Hey, Veronica?
I think I said the most important for me.
Great, thanks. Well, so just wrapping up, so we finish on time. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks Alex, thanks Veronica, Germán. It's been great to you and hearing a bit about the sustainability, about the objective of organizations in general, how to define it, how to approach it. It's a C-level role. It's not something that you can kind of like push down. The importance of, as Alex was saying, having boots on the ground and really understanding what companies are doing. So thanks everybody. Thank you all again. Have a great afternoon. And thanks you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Julio. Thank you, Alex. Germán.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alex, Julio.
Bye.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Bye.